Hi. So I've got a few things that I want to cover off on today. You'll see that across today, there's all of the, today being the 1st of September, that all of the next modules go up at the same time. So they'll go up between now and Friday. Part of the reason for that is to give you the capacity to be able to move around the modules and to be able to read into a few different areas. Now, we're going to have some core texts that will be discussed in each of the sessions with Maddie, but beyond that, we've also got this potential for having a more in-depth discussion around this idea of how to read Indigenous queer content, but also how to read other content that has an impact on comprehending the space in which Indigenous queer people inhabit. And so to that end, that's why we're talking about intersectionality. You've read and seen Crenshaw's discussion of what constitutes intersectionality. It's fascinating to see that in under 2 minutes, Crenshaw is able to explain both what intersectionality is and also, really importantly, what it is not. Now, anybody who's been on social media, and I really implore you to interrogate the social media space around these ideas, both of intersections, intersectionality, and on understanding about how people are describing experiences. The work that I do is centered on this notion of inclusivity rather than necessarily seeing this idea of silos. It comprehends a way to consider the connection between what might otherwise be framed as conflicting identities. Now, we know, just as a fundamental, that you can be Indigenous and queer. We know this not just because we understand enough about the discipline to know that, and the experience of people talking about queerness, but the discipline of queer studies. We know that it's not exclusive to this idea of complexity, and we know that in Indigenous studies, it's not exclusive to the idea that being Indigenous is the only defining characteristic for any individual or for a community. But for a lot of people who don't necessarily think about either cohorts, or people who are both, there isn't necessarily an understanding that these groups might connect. And so understanding that is really important. But one of the ways that it became comprehended a number of years ago was for the term intersectionality to be deployed in a way that I think is actually quite problematic. And that's why, in fact, you have the piece that's what is intersectionality piece that starts to describe exactly how intersectionality is understood by people who want to be able to use it as a term to talk about inclusivity. So what Crenshaw does is challenges that and said, this isn't about inclusivity, this is about compounding disadvantage. So that I think the really interesting thing in that 2-minute piece is where Crenshaw talks about this not being a grand theory. That's actually the term that she uses, grand theory. And instead what Crenshaw does is, says this is really just a way to be able to read and understand compounding disadvantage in order to address it. So that part of what, as an advocate, but also as a professor who works within an institution, has attempted to do is to operationalize this. So rather than it being a defining characteristic, it's been a strategy to be able to define how to move forward. And so what does it mean then for somebody to refer to themselves as an example, an intersectional feminist? Now, again, I said before, if you go on to somewhere like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or these social media spaces where people have a little blurb about who and what they represent, it's not uncommon to see somebody referring to themselves as an intersectional feminist. When they refer to themselves in that way and they talk about intersectionalism being a very important part of the work that they do, I'm always intrigued, because intersectionality is not about the work that someone does. It's about who they are. For somebody to refer to themselves as intersectional would indicate that they have compounding disadvantage themselves, not that others are, benefit from their comprehension of that. So in other words, rather than it being about, I'm pretty diverse, that makes me intersectional, it's actually about recognizing that the reason that Crenshaw came up with this idea of intersectionality, and other people have used it before in a much more complex way and since, and this was coined as a term in the way that it's come to be used in the late 80s, it was done to describe the experience of being, of having a worse effect and a far worse set of impacts on someone's life because of these multiple ideas of identity that other people were perceiving. And so the idea that somebody who is white and a woman would have a far better experience than someone who is Black and a woman is an intersectional issue. It's an issue of how those intersecting areas, where in the context of the US, where Crenshaw's writing about this, Black people have far higher rates of, as an example, incarceration as a process of sentencing, which is what she uses as case studies in that original study. The outcomes are far worse in terms of the sentencing than they are for white people who are also sentenced. And so, and then what she became interested in is not looking at what happens for Black and white people, but then specifically what happens for women. And Crenshaw in recent years has started to talk about queerness as well. And of course, in a lot of ways, this is because Crenshaw's work is about understanding frameworks of oppression. And in that way, it is really quite distinguished from the work that we do, which is not only focusing on this idea that being queer and Indigenous is oppressive. That is actually a colonial construct, right? And so we see that when we read Kai Pyle's work. And I think what's interesting about this work, I'm probably gonna butcher, even though I've actually heard Kai talk about Ozawindib a few times, but this is somebody who is a historical figure, from the 19th century, who is an Ojibwe trans woman, was declared a chief. And so part of what Kai does in writing this is that they've gone through and tried to understand what's been written already. So in some ways, it buys into that notion of the intersectional, which requires you to go, wait, this happened, and this happened. Now, in this case, there is a colonial structure that values some people over others, that wants to push some people into a very specific way of being understood. And there is a system where, so the colonial structures that occur at the time that Ozawindib is being inculcated into this idea of chiefdom that is in fact imposed. And we had something very similar in the context of Australia with king plates. You see it in most colonial spaces where somebody who's seen to be a figurehead, who is often articulate in the language of, or the confidence of colonial, within colonial structures, but to colonizers. And what they're really doing is creating a space in which there is the potential for a conversation with the First Nations peoples. So, is it problematic? Was it problematic? Yeah, of course. I think it probably continues to be problematic. This idea of somebody who speaks for but is appointed by the colonial state is pretty problematic. Now, having said that, that's both one of the renderings of and rememberings of Azawindib, but also one of the ways that we will always remember complex figures. So, and that is by the available history, by what is known. And so part of what Kai does is that they very specifically talk about who this figure was, not just what can be understood now, but how they were operationalized by the colonial system so that they became framed as gay, not as a woman. So a gay man, not as a woman, which is how they conceived of themselves and described themselves at the time. And that the whole notion of transness was not something that was able to be comprehended by the colonizer, which is, one of those moments that is very much up for grabs in terms of the discussion. Did people understand it? Maybe. Did people understand a language around it? Absolutely not. And the colonial language, we're talking about queerness here, but we could be talking about anything in the context of the colony, is that it contained. It was about setting up this notion of accession, this idea of everything being erased that was there before, and that everything is remade in the site of colony. And so queerness then can only align with what they understand in their own community. And what they understand in their own community depends on their relationship to their community. And you read some of that in the piece a few weeks ago that I'd written for Genealogy, and that talked about the colonial project of gender. But we see Pyle working through this in understanding not just these relationships and not just how the relationships are contained by the way that those colonizers and colonial communities could allow input from someone who sat on the outside, but also actually how that privileged the relationship in an interesting way. Because of course, the idea of the subaltern, which we're going to read about a lot more next week, and it's not a good term, it's a problematic term in a lot of ways. It's like badash as a term. It's this, that's an English language term. It's this notion of otherness. It's this notion of not as much as. It's this notion of the less than person. But there is an interesting thing about being someone who is framed within a subaltern experience, and that's that person, that figure, but also the person becomes not just contained by their personhood, which is the way that we talk about our bodies and our formation and the acceptance and the way that we travel in the world, but also by the kind of alien status of queer Indigenous people or any group of people who are seen to be incapable of being aligned with an existing colonial structure. So if you're not male, female, assigned female and male at birth, if you're not in a formal family structure that the colonizer understands, that in fact what you are is something that sits outside of it, something to be managed, erased, comprehended, all of these things in different measure. And for someone like Azawindib, their role was to try to find a way for themselves. And what Kai talks about in this piece is the ways that that relationship were actually managed by Azawindid, but also the ways that they could never be, because no matter what you think, the system and the structures will still have a very large say in what can be constructed. You know, it is a container and a structure that is, when we talk about structural change, we actually talk about shifting that, not just shifting how one person is comprehended or even a group of people are comprehended, but shifting the structures that inform that. And of course, at a time of colony, at the moment of colony, which arguably we're still in, but also there is a moment at which it becomes imposed for the first time. What happens is the people who have always been doing the work and have always been kind of central will sometimes be elbowed out. They'll sometimes find that they're not central. And so in that space, there is the potential for this notion of the more subaltern operating. But there's a risk, and that risk is not just a risk of how they're described in history, but a risk of how they're comprehended at the time. Now, how they're described in history is one of the things that Kai talks about. So this is, Kai Pyle is an emerging scholar in this field, in the field of queer Indigenous studies. They're a First Nations person operating across the borders of what's now known as Canada and the US. And they're talking about own community in this context, their own community. But they're also talking about the past, history. And often as you start to talk about what we are discussing here in this unit, but also what you're reading more broadly, you'll hear people say things like Indigenous people were never queer, or Indigenous, gay stuff is Indigenous, is an anathema to Indigenous people. It's not true. But what people will typically want is evidence. And evidence is something that we're going to talk about in a few weeks. We're going to talk about it in the context of the most recent census, but we're also going to talk about it in the context of how policy and the management of people through policy has contained. But actually, what Kai's talking about here is how expansive Azawindid made things at a time when the potential for that was actually pretty small. So these notions then are remembered by historians and comprehended differently. So what Kai starts with is saying, why did nobody ever tell me this? Why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we talking about the fact that it was a woman who was trans who was engaged in these discussions? If we knew this, it would change the landscape of that understanding. And of course, that's the answer to it. That's the answer to the why. But part of what we have to do is to recognize that an erasure is intentional. So to remove something that exists in a historical space is not only to get rid of the idea of it, because actually all of this historical information was available. It was available to hear how Azawindid talked about herself. It was entirely within the realm of historical research that you could find a whole lot of these discussions around her transness. It instead, in terms of the erasure, it was about whether people cared or not to bring that to the front, whether that became either a way to frame difference or, really crucially, a way to dismiss. We see it in an interesting way in European writing around the time of invasion in ancient Britain. So Britain, like a lot of colonizer countries, experienced colonization itself. And one of the groups that colonized it, many of you would be aware, were the Romans. Now, I mean, Romans are really interesting because, of course, most Romans did not come from Rome. It was effectively a job title, which meant people came from all over. It was an army that was made up of people who were paid for their work, and it was a very big employer. So part of what their work was for several hundred years as a Roman army, as largely a mercenary army, was to conquer in order to gather resources. So in that way, it operates as a colonial structure. So some of you may have heard, or you might look it up after you've seen this, of a place called Hadrian's Wall. Now, Hadrian's Wall, the name is formed from an important figure in the Roman army, Hadrian. And it's a wall that exists in parts. It was the older boundary that separated Scotland from England in the island of Britain. And part of the way that Hadrian is described as someone who is very intent on the idea of inclusion and exclusion. Exclusion is those people in Scotland who can't be contained and can't be controlled. Inclusion is the people in England who they believed could be. So, and it's an ancient border. So it's actually, when you see it currently, it's a little below the contemporary border of Scotland and England. But what's interesting about that particular space is that it becomes fortress, containment, control, session. And what we see on either side of this notion of session is that we see this idea of the unorderly suspect Scottish person who, would have been at the time, framed as Pictish, or as a Pict. Again, these are colonial terms, but they existed on the island of Albion. And so then what we have on the other side is that we have a very different idea of order and control and structure and an idea of the moral, which is not something that we always associate with Rome and Romans, but it's an important way to comprehend how Rome is configured as this imposing structure, this idea of the imposed. But what happened in ancient Rome doesn't really matter as much as how it's then described now, or how it's been described through centuries of renegotiations of these relationships. So why am I mentioning this in the context of talking about queer people, and in particular about this idea of coloniality and queerness? Even though Rome and Romans and the Roman army were slightly different beasts, what we have with Hadrian is someone who, in a historical context, has been reframed as a baddie, as someone who is deeply problematic, as someone who had complexity in ways that they didn't allow in their officer groups. Now, we don't actually know that, but this is how it's been described. And I always find that fascinating. So the way that historians will contemporize something based on their own understanding and experience. And what we had through the 19th century, where there became a very great interest in the idea of antiquity in Europe, at the same time as they were very interested in what we were doing as Indigenous people, there was this romanticism that's often reframed as primitivism. It's a pretty problematic term. It's a good one to understand. But there is a kind of aligned primitivism that happens with the deep past in antiquity in Europe. And that's what gets pushed onto Hadrian, who is framed as gay. He's framed as only interested in men and sexually lascivious, is framed by historians as someone who had unequal and problematic relationships with men, including with slaves. This is somebody who is framed in a really, really negative way throughout the 19th century and through a lot of the 20th century, even to the contemporary era. There's not, there are some interrogations that talk about the complexity of sexuality quite differently. And what's interesting in all of this is that the complexity of gender is a given, you know, so that again, this is how the people who are writing this can comprehend. And that's what we keep coming back to. And we come back to it because inclusions, connections, and intersections are really about navigating a system. Complexity is about navigating a system. Nobody really says, oh, it's terrible that you read 10 books. You know, nobody says, oh, it's terrible that you, instead of one, for instance, it's terrible that you, you know, you have an extra degree. Nobody says these things. This idea of complexity is largely seen as a very big positive, unless it's in the space of being managed. And then complexity becomes a reason. And so this idea of how complexity is formed is incredibly important. I wanted to include that video that was on getting things wrong, largely because in understanding the ways in which intersectionality is played out, it is often about this idea of seeing yourself represented. So it's often this idea of representation. And so intersectionality is sometimes positively charged in the way that it's used. I'm not talking about by Crenshaw, and I'm not even suggesting that it's automatically problematic, but it's not the function of intersectionality as an idea. It is a kind of recalibration in the same way as we see this notion of wanting to support, but not wanting to let go too much of the idea of own self complexity. I think it's important to comprehend that. And so for all of you, one important exercise in this is to think about your own complexity. Now, you don't need to write it out, you know, you don't need to disclose it, but you do need to comprehend it. Now, it's not a tick box. I mean, of course it's not. Like, I don't have a tick box that says I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. I often have to talk about it because of the work that I do, but I don't talk about it with my friends necessarily. You know, I don't turn up to coffee and go, oh, I'm a trans person. You know, I have a complexity that sits underneath the surface, because we all do. And that complexity can be what you like to read. It can be who you care about. It can be what you care about, absolutely. But it can also be what you're included and excluded from. And what we see is that in those zones of exclusion, historians become very overly focused. So we see that happening increasingly in the discussion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And starting from the next module, we're going to have a little bit more of a focus back onto this continent. One of the reasons that I wanted to go out large to come in a little more is just to understand the complexity of what that means, to comprehend that we're not alone in this. None of us are. And by that, I mean that a really important part of what I just said before in talking about Britain was this notion of otherness was even formed in this space of the colony that, or the colonizer that we know. This idea of not quite belonging, not quite being, not quite aligning is or needing to be controlled in the context of the making colony, needing to be contained, are important aspects of that. So, so I want to leave you with that, but also to just start to comprehend, I mean, as a process, it can be a kind of check-off list of who you are, but the way that you may conceive in talking about it is something far more complex, because you're far more complex. So you're not intersectional, because actually nobody is. People's experience can have compounding disadvantage, which can be an intersectional space. And understanding why one becomes operationalized and then recast as a way to talk about positive diversity is important, because a lot of it is around how frustrating and frustrated people feel by not being able to move forward positively on something. But it's also an argument for not doing it. So I guess I'm arguing that when people talk about themselves as intersectional feminists, and they don't mean that they're affected by compounding disadvantage, part of what they're doing is shifting the focus to themselves. But it's absolutely a thing that happens. And so start to unpack this and understand it if you can. Thanks.